Well, Richard, thank you very much for agreeing to have this discussion. In one sense, I suppose, we're old comrades in arms because we've collaborated on various responses to naive young Earth creationists. Would you like to say anything about that from the sort of Anglican point
Well, I
of view?
find it absolutely extraordinary that this kind of creationism is coming in at this stage of the 21st century. When I think that shortly after that famous debate in Oxford with my predecessor Samuel Wilberforce, Frederick Temple, who was later to become Archbishop of Canterbury, gave a lecture in Oxford, and he said, God doesn't just make the world, he does something much more wonderful. He makes the world make itself.
Yes.
And historians of science say that it was amazing how quickly the thinking Christian public in Britain actually took on board the theory of evolution, so that by the 1870s or 1880s it was no real problem to most thoughtful Christians. And it's extraordinary at this stage, you know, coming over from America, we get this creation. It's really baffling.
Yes, well, I agree, of course. But is there a sense in which they are sort of being true to their scriptures in a way that you're not? I mean, you've moved on from that, and might they say, well, we're the only ones who are carrying on the true tradition?
Well, it is true that until biblical criticism came in from Germany in the 1830s or 1840s, the church took a very literalistic view of the scriptures. They thought that the scriptures were science as well as history and geography and everything else. But we now know different from that. And what I would say, and I think most Christians would now want to say, that actually the Bible doesn't give us science, it gives us the science of particular ages. What it gives us is an ultimate meaning and purpose, or a purported meaning and purpose for things. In other words, in terms of creation, however the world came into existence, everything is ultimately dependent upon a ground of being, a power, an uncreated source of all existence. One may or may not believe that, but that is the fundamental meaning of those early wonderful chapters in the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
There's that, from my point of view, absolutely no incompatibility at all.
Yes. Can I turn to morality and ethics? I know that recently in the House of Lords you've been very active in the debate about euthanasia. To me, it sounds as though your position is what might be called an absolutist one on this. I know you're very liberal on all sorts of other things. As though you're taking an absolutist stand on human life. Would that be fair?
Well, it's a wee bit more nuanced than that. There is a famous conundrum called the policeman's dilemma. A driver is in a cab of a burning lorry. He's about to die in agony, and a policeman comes along. Should he shoot him so to keep him from burning to death in absolute agony? I would say yes, because I don't believe there are any exceptionalist rules. There are extreme examples, boundary situations, which are exceptions, but I don't believe that those exceptions should be legislated for. They are by their very nature exceptions, and I don't think you can draw great kind of long-term legal principles and rules from them. So that's one of the reasons why I'm opposed. There are all sorts of other reasons, because I'm very concerned about palliative care and enough good palliative care getting in place all over the country, about research into palliative care. Now, I absolutely accept there are still at the moment a few really agonizing situations. I accept that. I also accept that if I was in that situation, I don't know how I would act. You could never quite predict. But what really worries me at the moment is, as it were, prioritizing the value of human autonomy over every other value. People who stress the value of human autonomy say it is the person's individual choice at all times and all places which must take the priority. Now, I think that's a very kind of 17th, 18th century Western European view of what it is to be a human being, stressing the individual as an isolated, anguished individual making these great, big, heroic choices. I want to say to be a human being is to be bound up with other human beings, is to be interdependent with other human beings, and that when we're dependent upon other human beings, we don't lose our value. We may not be able to make many choices, but we're still of value as human beings. So that's the philosophical basis for the drive for assisted suicide or euthanasia does worry me in the way it prioritises human autonomy over every other consideration.
And that's interesting, because I would have thought in a way the opposite could be said, that the opposition, which it sounds as though you're not a simple member of, prioritises the sort of sacredness of human life, which clearly from your example of the lorry driver in the cab, you
I don't think human life is always absolute. I don't take that view. I mean, an obvious example, I'm not a pacifist. I mean, I think it's right sometimes to go to use arms in order to defend other people. So I don't make human life an absolute in that sense. Now, I know there are religious people who say, well, it's God who causes us to be born, and it's only God who should take our life away at the end. I don't actually take.
You're not one of them.
I'm not. I don't know. I think my argument, it actually stands up in secular, rational terms. It always it very much annoyed me in the House of Lords in the debate, where the people who are pro-euthanasia tried to say that all the arguments were really by religious people on religious grounds. That is not my worry. Real worry is this stressing of human autonomy. And you see, I think that we are dependent for a lot of our life. When we're in the womb, when we're children, perhaps when we're sick towards the end, we're dependent upon other people. And I also worry, this is another point which is difficult to make, and I'm not sure I've ever made it clearly enough, and it may not be totally convincing. But if a person is in extreme distress and they're asking to die, and you give them a means to die, or you actually administer something yourself to hasten them away, what kind of message is that conveying to them? Now, I know that the motivation can be totally right. You can say, I totally believe that people can be beautifully motivated to put that person out of that agony. But if you actually accede to that request, is there something more than that being actually conveyed by the very action, as though you're kind of hastening them out of the here and now? How do they receive that message? That's what worries me.
I want to move on from this, but just one more point I'd like to put to you, which actually comes from Lala, my wife, whose mother committed suicide.
Yes.
And she's very clear that her mother would not have committed suicide if she had known that when the time came for her to really want to die, a doctor would have been allowed to do it. So she, as it were, preempted. She killed herself long before she actually really wanted to, because she wanted to kill herself before she became incapable, before she lost, in other words, the autonomy that you're talking about. And this is sort of paradoxical, because it kind of means that if doctors were allowed to assist suicide, people would probably commit suicide less. And that's a paradox which people need to face up to, I think.
Well, I mean, obviously I respect what Lala has said and the example of her own mother. But you see, I think that palliative care has improved hugely over the last 10 or 20 years, and it needs to improve more. And I really think that we can get to the situation where people need not be in extreme distress when they die, and that we could have good palliative care all over the country. I mean, it's the experience of good hospices, for example, that actually when people have been there for a bit and they feel cared for, looked after, and their pain is kept under control, as it can be by proper administration of the right drugs at the right time, actually they don't ask to die. So that's what I would, and you see, I think if we legislate for euthanasia, it could stop people putting the right kind of motivation and the right kind of resources into good palliative care.
I can see that. Well, I hope you're right about that. All I can say is when my time comes, I shall have myself declared an animal and go to the vet. Can I move on? Obviously there are divisions and arguments within
but just taking you up on that, but I mean, supposing your loved ones say, but actually, I mean, I know you're in great distress, but actually we want to care for you, and we think that actually your life still has value. It may only be another month or so, but actually that month will be a very precious month, both to you and to me.
There's something a little bit odd, isn't there, about a religious person who believes that there is life after death, and an atheist who doesn't, should be taking these positions. I mean, in some ways, it might go the other way around.
I agree. It could go the other way around. Yes.
Can I move on to I don't know whether schism is the right term, but there are clearly deep arguments within the Anglican Church, and you're famously, and I think laudably, on the Anglican, on the liberal wing of the Anglican Church. Is there a sense in which there's again, I suppose it comes back to the point of maybe the other side are the ones who are being true to the fundamentals of the religion, and you, who are liberal and much closer to what I would think, are the one who's departing from certainly from the scriptural and perhaps from the fundamentals.
Well, if you take the issue of homosexuality, there's no doubt about it. There are a number of texts, not as many as people think, but a few texts, which clearly regard homosexuality as wrong, both in the Old Testament very strongly, but they're also there in the New Testament. But of course it's a question of how you interpret the Bible, whether it's really right to just simply extract a few isolated texts rather than seeing the whole message of the Bible, the whole message of Jesus. But I think there's another, perhaps even more fundamental one, which links in to your fundamental interest in evolution. Our understanding of what it is to be a gay or lesbian now is very, very different from what it was, let us say, in the Roman world when the New Testament's written. I mean, they really thought that people could really choose either to have homosexual relationships, heterosexual relationships, or be bisexual, as a lot of them chose. They thought it was purely a matter of choice. We now actually know that a significant percentage of people are predominantly attracted to members of their own sex. They didn't choose to be that way. The cause is still mysterious. We don't know whether genetic, biochemical, or psychological, or what. But that's how they find themselves. Now, it seems to me that we actually have to face that fact in exactly the same way. We have to face the fact that the world evolved over 4.5 billion years of this earth. This is one of the facts you have to face. And I would want to say that there are certain fundamental principles in the Bible about marriage, about relationships, about loyalty, about faithfulness, which are quite properly transferable from heterosexual relationships to homosexual relationships. Now, so it's a question of the changing facts as well as a changing understanding of how the Bible should be interpreted.
This, of course, is all music to my ears, but I'm kind of left wondering why you stick with Christianity at all, therefore. And maybe some of the fundamentalists might say just that to you.
Well, I'm not quite so isolated as you might think. I mean, there are. I like to think there are a good number of Christians.
Yes,
who, I think that perhaps it may be you spend too long in fundamentalist circles.
Yes.
No, the reason I stick with Christianity is the fundamental truth and beauty of the Christian faith, as it has come across to me, that there is a wise and loving power ultimately behind this universe, that this power has been radiantly accessible in a human life, in Jesus, that there is a Spirit of God within every human being with which we can be in touch to help guide us and strengthen his life. All this, first of all, I find enormously attractive. And secondly, it has taken hold of me in such a way that actually I believe it to true. And that taking hold is not just a purely rational thing, though it is rational, I believe, but it is also obviously emotional and spiritual. Cardinal Newman once says, the whole person moves, paper logic is but the record of it. And I think that's probably true. The whole of me has been attracted and drawn into the Christian faith. It's partly rational, partly emotional, partly spiritual, partly moral.
I mean, to detach it from you personally, and I certainly didn't mean to suggest that you're on your own. I know you're not. I once went to a seminar in Oxford given by a Roman Catholic nun, and she stood up and said all the sort of right-on liberal things that I would wish her to say and which you would wish her to say, and she got rapturous applause from the students, as you can imagine. But I was sort of feeling, well, the only reason she's getting this applause is that she's a nun who's saying these wonderfully liberal, sensible things. And you couldn't help feeling, I mean, I think I maybe actually asked her, well, why do you stay being a nun? If you think this, why don't you just throw over the Roman Catholic Church and Well, join the Anglican Church, for example.
Well, I think that the progressive and the more reactionary elements within the church have always jostled with one another. I mean, I think of John Ball, the priest who led the peasants' revolt with the wonderful phrase, you know, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then
the gentleman.
Gentleman. So the radical elements and the more conservative have always jostled with one another. The church has a good record on some issues. I mean, I think its role in helping to abolish slavery and certain social reforms in the 90s, and it has an obstructive record in other areas. I mean, I think I have to face the fact as a believer that the church, because it is an institution and therefore seeks to persist through space and time, will, on a number of issues, whether I like it or not, be slow moving. Because the point about an institution is that it seeks to gather the insights of past ages and transmit them. And it is inevitably, therefore, fairly slow moving. And I mean, the alternative is to have a Christianity without an institution. But of course, then it would die out within a generation. If it's to persist through space and time, it needs to take institutional form. And therefore, although I may not like it, it's bound to be rather slow in taking on board some of the insights. I would hope also it would be driven by something of the radicalism of Jesus himself, who clearly wasn't an institutional man and set before people the ideal of the kingdom of God and wanted people to live it out here and now. I hope that, you know, that is still abroad even within the institutional church.
I hope so too. I once actually wrote an article called Atheists for Jesus, and I actually had somebody gave me a T-shirt with Atheists for Jesus.
Well, do you know there are two members of that society now? The other one is John Mortimer. He's also, I think,
really?
I should put you two together.
Yes. Good. One of the things that the church does, of course, is get involved in education, traditionally has. And in many cases, it's, of course, a very good education. I worry, however, about the tying of labels around the necks of children who are too young to know what their religious views are. And this shows itself especially in places like Northern Ireland, where a child is branded, a Catholic child or a Protestant child, long before it knows what its views are. And then suffers, and I really mean suffers in the case of Northern Ireland, from that. I have a kind of immediate recoiling against the very phrase Catholic child, Protestant child, Muslim child. Do you have any of that, or are you quite happy?
No, I do share your worries. I mean, think particularly about Northern Ireland, and there's no doubt about it, religious education can in certain services be divisive for the reasons you mention and other reasons. I think on the positive side, I genuinely do believe, I wouldn't obviously necessarily think that you would share this, that for a child to be brought up in an environment which is based on the assumption and suffused with the feeling that there is an ultimate meaning and purpose to human life, that our sense of human worth and dignity is ultimately grounded in something beyond itself. I think that this gives a dimension and a kind of richness to an early child's education that it is difficult to think of as a purely secular education giving. So I cannot help feeling that however strong the values might be in a purely secular school, and I have no doubt about it that they can be very strong indeed, nevertheless there is a kind of deprivation there of what I would call this other dimension, a sense of the of richness, which I think a religious early upbringing can give.
Well, I'm all for that kind of richness, and I suppose I should take that as a challenge to try to think of how I would, if I were planning a school, how I would try to put that richness in. I do agree with you that it is important.
Yeah, because I mean, if we just to sort of switch the tack of the conversation a bit, I mean, I know from your own writings that you have a very deep sense of wonder and joy at the universe. For you, the universe is not a bleak place, and you love poetry, and poets express a lot of what you are. I also know, and this is perhaps even more important, you don't think that just because there is competition through the evolutionary process that human beings are therefore therefore inevitably conditioned and determined in that way, and you have a very strong moral sense, that actually we ought to counteract that. Now you see, I think that both your sense of wonder and joy in the universe, and particularly the whole animal world, and your strong sense of that it is a moral thing to be a human being, as well as a wonderful thing to be a human being, I think that those are ultimately grounded in a religious view of the universe. They make most sense against the background and within the context of a religious view of the universe.
We could be playing with words here, couldn't we? I mean, in one sense, exactly what you express is correct, and you could even use the word religious. I mean, there is a sense in which I'm a very religious person, and I think you've captured that sense in what you've just said. It's really a matter of whether the word is appropriate, because for most people, the word implies a supernaturalism, which I don't buy, because I think in a way it makes it less wonderful. I mean, I think that the thought that the universe is an orderly place which we can understand and which is devoid of capricious, wanton interventions at very least. I mean, miracles I certainly wouldn't wish to have any truck with. And I think I'm religious in the same sort of way as Einstein would have called himself religious. He didn't believe in a supernatural God, but he had a very, very deep reverence. And I think I have that.
I'm sure you have. I think you do. I'm sure you do. But I was particularly interested in your phrase, an ordered universe, which we can use our rationality to understand. I mean, I absolutely agree with that, because I think this is ultimately grounded in a divine ordering, a wisdom, of which, as the old Stoics used to say, our human rationality is a kind of spark. And again, it's not that your view is any way invalid. It is just that if you place it within the context of an overall religious belief, you can see how it all beautifully fits together. The world is ordered, and you can understand it rationally and explore it, whether it's through maths or physics or evolution or whatever it might be, because it is ultimately rationally ordered and grounded in an ultimate wisdom.
I have a colleague in America, a biologist, who is a devout Christian, and he's one of the fiercest opponents of creationism and intelligent design that they've got in America, and he does it very, very well. And his view is that intelligent design stroke creationism is a form of blasphemy, because he sees the ordering of the world as something that his God put into it, and to get in there and meddle in the form of, say, miracles, which naive creationism certainly is a kind of blasphemy. But I take it that as an Anglican bishop, you wouldn't deny miracles, and I think you ought to be consistent with what you've just been saying.
Well, first of all, I believe that there is a very severe limit to the number of miracles that any God could perform without denying his fundamental purpose.
That's just hedging.
No, I mean, I sincerely, very passionately believe this.
Right.
I think there's a very severe, because I think if God was doing miracles the whole time, then we would live in an Alice in Wonderland type of world. It would be unpredictable, and you and I wouldn't be able to have a rational conversation, because rationality can only emerge in a world which is ordered and stable and predictable. So I actually seriously believe this, but I don't roll them out altogether, and it may be that certain human beings have an extraordinary potential and power which we don't fully understand, and which are more developed in some people than others. Now, when it comes, for instance, to the healing miracles of Jesus, I actually have no difficulty about believing the majority of those. I mean, I actually do believe he had an extraordinary ability to heal, which was developed in him in an extraordinary way, and relied in part upon the kind of faith which was aroused in him. If clearly some other miracles I would find very difficult. So I wouldn't want to rule them out altogether.
I think I wouldn't want to rule out some healing miracles, because, and I think maybe you're kind of saying the same thing. I mean, I know the power of psychosomatic medicine. I know the power of placebos. I could very well imagine that somebody who has, and it's not to denigrate the illness. I mean, a psychosomatic illness is a very real illness. But to have a powerful personality who lays his hands on you. I mean, I get it with a doctor. I mean, a doctor who gives me confidence.
Yeah.
Doesn't actually have to give me any pills. It's just.
But I think I want to go beyond confidence. And I would want to say that there probably are some people who are so profoundly spiritual, so profoundly filled with the Spirit of God, that they do have extraordinary powers.
Which you would actually call supernatural.
I would call them supernatural in the sense that they are filled with a particular kind of spirit. It's not so much that there is a divine puppeteer pulling and pushing strings. It is rather particular human beings have, from the Spirit of God within them, developed this extraordinary capacity overall through a closeness to God, but also probably through very extensive spiritual disciplines. And I'm thinking of certain kind of Russian starets, certain kind of holy people, hermits, the desert fathers, all these things perhaps way beyond our comprehension. But I'm trying to believe that there have been, and there probably still are, people like that.
Beyond our comprehension, of course, still could well be at the moment.
Yeah.
It could well be encompassed within science, because science, of course, is incomplete.
I think a lot of it could be encompassed within science, but it may be that there are certain spiritual capacities which people have, which can't totally be encompassed or explained by science in the end.
Right. I mean, what about sort of really big miracles like the virgin birth? What do you think about that?
Well, I never want to elevate the miracle of the virgin birth into something that people really ought to discuss a lot, because I don't think that it's on a par with the resurrection, for example. I mean, I actually do believe that the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is absolutely fundamental to Christianity in a way that I don't believe the virgin birth is. I mean, I'm happy to follow the tradition on the virgin birth. It's not so much that I passionately believe it or passionately disbelieve it. It just, why should one make a great fuss?
You don't really mind very much.
Why make a great fuss about this, where actually I do think that the resurrection of Jesus is pretty fundamental. Well, it is absolutely fundamental to Christian faith.
Yes. So you're not really quite being true to your. I mean, that discussion we had about miracles in the Alice in Wonderland world.
Yes.
There's a kind of, it's almost though you think there's a kind of ration of miracles which mustn't be exceeded, or we get into looking glass territory.
We can't say what that ration is.
Yeah.
We can't predict in advance. All I do know is that if miracles were happening all the time, whenever we wanted them to happen, then human life as we know it couldn't exist.
Yes. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Many thanks. One of the political issues of the day which affects religion is the government's desire for a bill against incitement to religious hatred. What's your view on that?
Well, in principle, I regard religious hatred as unacceptable as racial hatred. The problem is to devise a bill which actually also safeguards free speech. And so in the House of Lords I was arguing that there ought to be a small all-party group working with the government to try to get in some amendments which make it quite clear that religious controversy couldn't be brought under this bill. And at the moment I think it remains to be seen as to whether the government is at all willing to do that. I mean, I think there's no doubt the bill as we have it at the present moment is unacceptable. I would be prepared to support a bill if it had enough safeguards in it, and I think we have to wait and see whether there are going to be any safeguards.
Is there just at the moment a particular push towards faith schools more than we've had in the past?
I think undoubtedly there is, and I think there are two reasons for this. One is the more superficial one, and that is the government is supportive of faith-based schools. But the deeper reason is, I think, that there is a great malaise in our educational system, and a lot of parents are very worried about what goes on in schools. I mean, the kind of horror stories that you hear about in schools, many parents feel that their children don't get any kind of proper moral or religious education in schools, and I think that's pretty widespread, that kind of feeling, and I anticipate it growing. And together with that, I mean, there is a great growth in evangelical type churches, and I don't mean that they're all fundamentalists, and they vary a lot. I mean, there's been a growth in the black Pentecostalist churches, black-led churches, for example. But there's no doubt about it that in addition to the great growth in spirituality, which is the main phenomenon in Europe, as we know, most people in Europe regard themselves as spiritual rather than religious. But in addition to that, the evangelical churches are undoubtedly strong and flourishing, and certainly much stronger than when I was first ordained 40 years ago.
Would you support religious schools which give that sense of moral purpose and things, but which are not tied to one denomination or sect, and perhaps taught comparative religion?
Well, I've actually been part of a small trustee body led by a lovely rabbi, which has been trying to set up a genuine faith-based faith school where Jews, Muslims and Christians would learn about their own religion in a serious way, but would learn it within a school where there were also
members... Let me correct you for just one moment, Bishop.
Yes.
Children of Jews, Muslims and Christians would learn.
Right.
Sorry,
yes.
I was just rising to that.
Right. Well, anyway, in this little charity, which I'm a kind of founder member of it, we are trying to set up a school for the children of Jews, Muslims and Christians, so they could all be learning together in the same school. But the difference between that and an ordinary state school is that religion would be taken very seriously. For instance, Jews would learn, or the Jewish children would learn Hebrew, and the Muslim children would learn Arabic. Whether that gets off the ground or not, I don't know. But I think there's something even more fundamental, and that is the curriculum. I'm basically supportive of faith-based schools, but I do think the curriculum needs to be very, very carefully watched by the Department of Education and Science, and not only what is taught, but how it's taught. Because I do think that what goes on in schools should be genuinely educational and not simply propaganda. Yes. And if one has a worry about certain new types of school, you worry about they might in the end be simply agents and instruments of propaganda rather than genuine education.
My prediction is, I wish you luck with your trust, but you won't get much support from most of the...
Well, we're getting a lot of interest anyway.
Yes.
We're getting a lot of interest.
Good. It's been suggested that religious moderates betray...
Sorry,
They saw us and just deliberately did that.
Yeah.
Original sin. Let that one go by as well.
It's been suggested that religious moderates betray both faith and reason, whereas religious fundamentalists betray only reason.
I think that moderates need to be passionate both about their religious beliefs and about rationality. And it's possible to be a passionate moderate. It's much more difficult because, of course, as we know, the press tends to think in terms of sound bites and of headlines. It's very, very difficult to get across any kind of rational case, or let alone a nuanced case, in the kind of society in which we live. But I think we need to go on working at it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.